power doesn't disappear when a uniform comes off. Sometimes it just walks beside you unnoticed. On a bright Tuesday morning in downtown Ashford, Georgia, traffic rolled steadily beneath clear blue skies as office workers hurried toward glass towers. Food trucks served the lunchtime crowd, and tourists paused to admire the restored brick buildings that lined Main Street. Everything looked ordinary, the kind of peaceful morning a city would proudly advertise on postcards, until a single patrol car eased toward the curb and changed the direction of countless lives. Officer Ethan Brooks stepped out with the confidence of a man who believed experience had taught him everything worth knowing. His polished badge reflected the morning sun as his eyes locked onto a tall black man wearing faded blue jeans, worn leather boots, and a simple gray jacket. There was nothing flashy about the stranger. No security detail, no expensive watch, no official vehicle waiting nearby. Just a man quietly studying the sidewalks, stopping occasionally to greet local shop owners with a warm smile that seemed strangely familiar to people passing by. Ethan watched from a distance, convinced the man's calm demeanor was nothing more than an act. In his mind, someone who lingered around government buildings without looking important had to be hiding something. He crossed the sidewalk with measured steps, placing himself directly in the stranger's path. "Sir, I need to see some identification," he said firmly. The man looked up without the slightest hint of fear or frustration. His expression remained composed, almost thoughtful, as though he had expected this moment long before it arrived. "Of course, officer," he answered politely. "May I ask why?" Ethan ignored the question. "Hands where I can see them." Conversations nearby faded into uneasy silence. A woman carrying coffee slowed her pace. A delivery driver reached for his phone. Within seconds, curious eyes turned toward the growing encounter. The stranger slowly raised his hands, making every movement deliberate and calm. "My name is Marcus Bennett," he said evenly. "I'm happy to cooperate." Ethan barely listened. He searched Marcus's pockets after receiving permission, found only a wallet, a folded notebook, and a small set of keys, then frowned when he noticed there was no visible city employee badge. "You expect me to believe you're just taking a walk around City Hall?" Ethan asked with a skeptical smile. Marcus answered with the same quiet confidence. "Sometimes the best way to understand a city is to see it without anyone announcing you're coming." The response only deepened Ethan's suspicion. A few bystanders exchanged confused glances, unable to understand why the conversation felt increasingly tense despite Marcus remaining respectful. Someone began recording on a cell phone. Another whispered that the officer seemed unusually determined. Ethan requested dispatch to check Marcus's identification, but before any confirmation arrived, he made another decision. "For now," he announced loudly enough for the crowd to hear, "you're being detained while we sort this out." A murmur spread across the sidewalk. Marcus did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked directly at Ethan and asked one calm question that hardly anyone noticed in the moment. "Officer, are you absolutely certain this is the decision you want to make?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "I'm completely certain." Marcus gave a slow nod, almost as though he were accepting something inevitable rather than unexpected. Then, with remarkable composure, he added, "In that case, when the time is right, I'd like permission to make one phone call." Marcus Bennett lowered his hands without the slightest trace of resentment, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it was unfolding, while the growing crowd searched his face for anger that never arrived. Instead, they found quiet confidence, the kind that could not be manufactured under pressure. A teenage college student standing outside a nearby coffee shop whispered, "Why is he so calm?" An older man answered under his breath, "Because he knows something we do not." Officer Ethan Brooks interpreted the silence differently. To him, Marcus's composure looked rehearsed, almost calculated, reinforcing the assumptions already forming inside his mind. Dispatch answered, through Ethan's radio, informing him that the identification check was taking longer than expected because of a system delay. Ethan frowned. The delay only convinced him he had made the correct decision. "Convenient," he muttered. "That happens more often than people think." Marcus glanced toward the historic courthouse across the street where the American flag moved gently in the warm breeze. Several city employees entered through the front doors without recognizing him from a distance. A reminder that outside campaign posters and televised press conferences, public officials often blended into everyday life. That anonymity had always fascinated Marcus. Years earlier, he had promised himself that if he ever held public office, he would never become so surrounded by security and ceremony that he forgot what ordinary citizens experienced. Every few weeks, he left the official vehicle behind, dressed simply, and walked through different neighborhoods without announcing his arrival. Sometimes he complimented a small business owner. Sometimes he asked residents about broken sidewalks or abandoned buildings. Sometimes he simply listened. Those quiet walks had shaped some of the city's most successful improvement projects because people spoke honestly when they believed no politician was listening. None of that mattered to Ethan in this moment. He looked toward the gathering crowd and noticed more phones being raised into the air. Everyone stepped back. He called firmly, "This is an active investigation." His words created a wider circle, but nobody truly left. Curiosity had already taken hold. Marcus finally spoke again, his voice steady enough that everyone nearby could hear every syllable without effort. "Officer Brooks, I appreciate that you have a responsibility to investigate situations that concern you. I only hope every decision today is based on facts instead of assumptions." Ethan folded his arms. "Facts are exactly what I am collecting." Marcus nodded respectfully. "Then I believe the facts will eventually speak for themselves." The sentence lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Even those recording the encounter sensed there was something unusual about the exchange. Marcus never challenged the officer's authority, never attempted to embarrass him, and never demanded special treatment. He simply stood patiently beneath the morning sun as traffic continued flowing through downtown Ashford, almost as though time itself had slowed around them. A light breeze carried the distant sound of church bells striking 11 o'clock. Marcus checked the old wristwatch he had worn for nearly 15 years before looking back at Ethan. "Officer," he said gently, "when your investigation reaches its conclusion, I would still like permission to make that phone call. I believe it will answer every question much faster than either of us expects." Ethan gave a confident smile that drew quiet laughter from one of the onlookers. "You will get your phone call," he replied. "And after that, we will all find out exactly who you really are." The waiting became heavier than the questions themselves. Every passing minute drew more attention, and with every new face joining the edge of the crowd, the atmosphere shifted from routine curiosity to quiet anticipation. Across the street, business owners stepped outside their storefronts, pretending to sweep sidewalks or rearrange displays while stealing careful glances toward the unusual encounter. The city continued moving around them, yet the small circle surrounding Marcus Bennett seemed frozen in its own pocket of time. Officer Ethan Brooks remained convinced that patience would validate every decision he had made. He glanced once more at the identification still resting in his hand before looking directly at Marcus. "You keep acting like none of this bothers you," Ethan observed. Marcus offered a faint smile. "Getting upset rarely helps people understand one another." Ethan shook his head. "Most people become nervous when they are being questioned." Marcus answered without hesitation. "Most people also hope they will be judged by what they have done instead of what someone assumes about them." Those words caused several people standing nearby to exchange uncomfortable looks. A young mother quietly lowered her phone for a moment, reflecting on what she had just heard. An elderly veteran standing near the courthouse entrance folded his arms and continued watching in thoughtful silence. Nobody interrupted. Nobody shouted. It was the kind of stillness that often appeared just before something important revealed itself. Inside Marcus's mind, however, another memory surfaced. Nearly 3 years earlier, during his first campaign for mayor, he had stood before a crowded community center and made a promise that many political advisors had urged him not to make. He had promised transparency that began with himself. If city departments expected accountability from citizens, then public officials should experience the city exactly as ordinary residents did. That promise had become more than campaign language. It had become part of his weekly routine. Without photographers, speeches, or television cameras, Marcus visited neighborhoods wearing ordinary clothes, listened to frustrated families, rode public transportation, and walked streets where residents often believed nobody in power ever visited. Those experiences had shaped every major reform his administration introduced. Unfortunately, they had also exposed uncomfortable truths about how differently some people were treated based on first impressions alone. Marcus had hoped those moments were becoming less common. Standing beneath the warm Georgia sun, he quietly wondered whether there was still more work left to do than he had imagined. Ethan's radio suddenly crackled again. Dispatch apologized for the continued delay, explaining that multiple government database systems were temporarily offline because of scheduled maintenance. Ethan exhaled sharply. Perfect timing, he muttered with visible frustration. Marcus remained composed. Technology has a way of testing everyone's patience. Ethan looked at him carefully. You really believe this is all going to end in your favor? Marcus met his eyes calmly. I believe the truth usually arrives eventually. Sometimes it simply takes a different route than we expect. The sentence lingered in Ethan's thoughts longer than he cared to admit. Even so, pride refused to let doubt take hold. Around them, more city employees began recognizing something strangely familiar about the man standing quietly beside the patrol car. One woman narrowed her eyes, as though searching her memory. Another employee paused halfway up the courthouse steps before slowly turning back toward the scene. Recognition hovered just beyond reach, but nobody spoke first. Marcus noticed the subtle reactions without acknowledging them. Instead, he looked once more at Officer Brooks and said with genuine courtesy, "Whenever you are ready, I would appreciate that phone call. I have a feeling today is about to become important for reasons neither of us expected this morning." Officer Ethan Brooks studied Marcus Bennett for another long moment, expecting the calm expression to crack under pressure, but it never did. The confidence standing before him was not loud, not arrogant, and certainly not theatrical. It was quiet, disciplined, and strangely reassuring, which only made Ethan more determined to prove that his instincts were correct. "You have answered every question with another polite sentence," Ethan said. "That does not explain why you have been walking around government buildings without identifying yourself." Marcus answered gently, "Because walking through my own city should not require an announcement." Ethan dismissed the statement with a brief shake of his head. "That sounds nice, but people can claim anything." Marcus nodded. "That is true, which is exactly why facts matter more than assumptions." Those nearby heard every word. A local reporter who happened to be leaving the courthouse stopped several yards away after recognizing the unusual scene. He did not know Marcus was the mayor from this distance, but something about the respectful exchange contrasted sharply with the growing tension surrounding it. More people quietly lifted their phones, recording without interrupting. Ethan noticed the cameras, but believed they only reinforced the importance of showing confidence. "Let me ask you one more time," he said. "Who exactly are you here to meet?" Marcus looked toward City Hall before returning his attention to the officer. "Today I intended to observe, listen, and learn. That was my only appointment." Ethan frowned. "Observe what?" Marcus smiled faintly. "How people experience this city when they believe nobody important is watching." The answer frustrated Ethan even more because it sounded philosophical rather than practical. To him, Marcus seemed to be avoiding simple answers with carefully chosen words. He folded his notebook closed and looked toward his patrol car as another message came across the radio. Dispatch still had no confirmation because several municipal databases remained temporarily unavailable. Ethan sighed. "Until I receive verification, nothing changes." Marcus accepted the statement with another calm nod. "I understand." Several people in the crowd whispered among themselves. One construction worker quietly remarked that the man being questioned had remained more patient than anyone he had ever seen during an unexpected stop. A woman standing beside him replied, "That kind of patience usually comes from someone who knows exactly who they are." Neither realized how close those words were to the truth. Across the street, The front doors of City Hall opened, and two administrative employees stepped outside, carrying folders for a scheduled council meeting. One of them glanced toward the gathering crowd before slowing her pace. She squinted, studying Marcus from a distance, almost recognizing his familiar posture, yet the plain clothes made the connection difficult. She hesitated instead of calling out. Marcus noticed her hesitation but deliberately looked away. He had no desire to influence what happened next. If today revealed a deeper problem, he wanted the truth to unfold naturally. Ethan stepped closer, maintaining a professional but increasingly rigid posture. "You mentioned a phone call earlier," he said. "You seem unusually confident about it." Marcus answered without changing his tone, because sometimes one conversation can reveal more truth than hours of assumptions. Ethan gave a short, skeptical laugh. "You really believe one phone call is going to change everything?" Marcus met his eyes with complete sincerity. "No, officer. The phone call will not change anything. It will simply allow everyone else to see what has been true since the moment we first met on this sidewalk." The conversation ended, but the silence that followed carried far more weight than the words themselves. Officer Ethan Brooks glanced once more toward the patrol car before reaching into his pocket and removing Marcus Bennett's cell phone. He held it for a second, almost as though deciding whether granting the request was worth the trouble. Around them, the crowd had nearly doubled. Office employees lingered outside buildings longer than their lunch breaks allowed. Drivers slowed as they passed. Even the distant sounds of the city seemed softer, replaced by the quiet expectation that something unusual was about to happen. Ethan finally looked back at Marcus. "You wanted one phone call," he said. "You have exactly one. That is all." Marcus answered with the same respectful tone that had remained unchanged since the beginning of the encounter. "Thank you, officer." Ethan unlocked the phone after Marcus calmly provided the passcode and handed it back without lowering his guard. He folded his arms and added confidently, "Whoever you call is not going to change the facts." Marcus accepted the device with steady hands. "No," he replied. "The facts have never changed. Only what people believe about them." Ethan smirked, convinced he was about to watch another unsuccessful attempt by an ordinary citizen to escape responsibility. Several people in the crowd leaned forward, hoping to hear the conversation. Marcus turned slightly, not to hide the call, but simply to avoid speaking over the growing noise around him. He selected a single contact without scrolling through the screen, as though the number had been committed to memory long ago. The call connected almost immediately. Marcus spoke in an even, professional voice. "Good morning. This is Marcus Bennett. I'm standing on the east side of Main Street near City Hall. I would appreciate your presence whenever possible." He paused for only a moment before listening carefully. "No, there is no emergency. Everyone is safe. I simply believe it would be helpful if you came in person." Marcus ended the call after less than 30 seconds. No raised voice. No dramatic explanation. No request for special treatment. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and quietly resumed waiting. Ethan looked almost disappointed. "That was it?" he asked. "I expected something more impressive." Marcus smiled politely. "The people who need information already have it." Ethan laughed softly. "You really think someone important is coming because of that conversation?" Marcus answered with complete sincerity. "I believe people who value responsibility usually arrive when they understand the situation." The words settled over the crowd like a gentle breeze. Nobody knew who had answered the call. Nobody heard the name on the other end. Yet something about Marcus's confidence caused several bystanders to stop whispering altogether. A courthouse employee glanced repeatedly toward the entrance of City Hall, sensing an unusual feeling she could not explain. Across the street, another city worker checked his watch before looking toward the intersection as though expecting unexpected visitors. Ethan remained unmoved. To him, every passing second confirmed that nothing extraordinary would happen. He had already convinced himself that the encounter would end with routine paperwork and another ordinary shift completed. Marcus looked toward the clear afternoon sky for a brief moment before returning his attention to the sidewalk stretching ahead. He had walked these streets countless times as both a private citizen and a public servant. Today, However, the city itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for truth to arrive one vehicle at a time. The next 5 minutes felt longer than the previous 30. Nobody announced that anything was changing, yet everyone sensed it. Conversations became quieter. Cell phones remained raised, but even those recording seemed less interested in capturing a confrontation than witnessing whatever came next. Officer Ethan Brooks shifted his weight, glancing repeatedly toward the end of Main Street before checking his watch. "Looks like your important visitor is running late," he said with quiet satisfaction. Marcus Bennett answered with the same composed voice that had never once risen above a normal conversation. People who carry responsibility do not always arrive quickly. They arrive carefully. Ethan smiled. "That sounds like another one of your speeches." Marcus gave a small nod. Sometimes patience explains more than speed ever can. Before Ethan could respond, the distant sound of approaching engines drifted through downtown. At first, nobody paid much attention. Government vehicles frequently traveled near City Hall. But within seconds, several dark sport utility vehicles turned onto Main Street in perfect sequence, moving steadily rather than urgently. There were no flashing emergency lights, no sirens, just a quiet, deliberate procession that immediately caught the attention of everyone standing nearby. One by one, pedestrians stopped walking. Store owners stepped outside. Office workers looked through second-floor windows. Ethan watched the vehicles with mild curiosity, assuming some scheduled government meeting was about to begin. "Busy day at City Hall," he remarked casually. Marcus simply observed the approaching convoy without speaking. The lead vehicle slowed before reaching the courthouse, followed closely by the others. Uniformed municipal security officers stepped out first, scanning the area with calm professionalism instead of alarm. Behind them emerged several senior city officials wearing identification badges that reflected in the afternoon sunlight. A woman standing near the coffee shop quietly covered her mouth as recognition spread across her face. "That cannot be," she whispered before stopping herself. Another city employee who had been leaving the administration building froze halfway down the steps, staring directly at Marcus. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief almost instantly. Ethan noticed the reactions and frowned. They were not looking at the arriving officials. They were looking at the man standing quietly beside him. For the first time that morning, uncertainty found a place inside Ethan's thoughts. It was small, almost invisible, but impossible to ignore. He followed the direction of everyone else's eyes before looking back at Marcus, whose calm expression had not changed in the slightest. The convoy came to a complete stop. Doors opened with quiet precision. More officials exited the vehicles, followed by the chief of police, Richard Collins, whose face carried none of the relaxed confidence he usually displayed during public appearances. Instead, his eyes immediately searched the crowd until they settled on Marcus. Without hesitation, Chief Collins began walking briskly across the sidewalk, accompanied by the city attorney, the director of municipal security, and several members of the mayor's executive staff. Nobody spoke. Nobody rushed. The silence surrounding their approach somehow carried more authority than shouted commands ever could. Ethan instinctively straightened his posture, assuming they were responding to assist with his investigation. "Perfect timing," he murmured under his breath. "Now we can finally clear this up." Marcus looked toward the approaching group and quietly folded his hands in front of him. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction, only quiet patience. As the distance between them closed to less than 20 feet, the chief of police removed his cap, his pace never slowing, while every member of the delegation focused entirely on the man Ethan still believed was simply waiting for answers. Chief Richard Collins stopped a few feet in front of Marcus Bennett, removed his cap completely, and spoke with unmistakable respect. "Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor. I apologize for the delay." The words landed over the sidewalk with stunning silence. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. The dozens of people surrounding the scene looked from Marcus to the chief of police and back again, trying to understand whether they had heard correctly. Officer Ethan Brooks remained frozen where he stood, his confident expression dissolving into complete disbelief. "Mr. Mayor," he repeated quietly, almost unable to recognize his own voice. Marcus turned toward Chief Collins with the same calm smile he had worn since the beginning of the morning. "Good afternoon, Chief. Thank you for coming." The chief nodded respectfully before looking toward Ethan, then back to Marcus. "We received your call immediately. The city attorney, your executive, staff, and municipal security are all here." Behind him, the city attorney stepped forward with a concerned expression. "Mr. Mayor, are you all right?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "Yes, I am perfectly fine. Everyone has remained safe and professional." Even after everything that had happened, he deliberately chose words that lowered the temperature instead of raising it. The crowd noticed. Several people slowly lowered their phones, not because the moment had become less important, but because it had become more meaningful than anyone expected. Ethan looked at Marcus with wide eyes, replaying every conversation from the past hour inside his mind. Every polite answer, every calm smile, every opportunity Marcus had been given to reveal his position directly. Then he remembered the simple sentence that now echoed louder than anything else. "The facts have never changed, only what people believe about them." Suddenly, those words carried an entirely different meaning. Chief Collins faced Ethan with measured professionalism. "Officer Brooks," he said evenly, "do you understand who you have been speaking with?" Ethan swallowed before answering. "Yes, Chief. I do now." His voice had lost every trace of certainty. Marcus quietly stepped forward before anyone else could continue. "Chief, before we discuss titles, I would like to clarify something." Every eye returned to him. "Officer Brooks treated me according to the conclusions he reached this morning. That is what concerns me. My position is not the issue. The real question is whether an ordinary citizen without my title would have experienced this day differently." Nobody answered. The silence itself became the answer. The city attorney lowered her eyes thoughtfully. Several members of the executive staff exchanged uncomfortable glances. Even some bystanders who had arrived only minutes earlier suddenly understood that this was no longer about one misunderstanding between two individuals. It had become a reflection of something much larger. Marcus continued speaking with remarkable composure. "If revealing my office is the only reason circumstances changed today, then we have learned the wrong lesson." Chief Collins nodded slowly, understanding exactly what Marcus meant. "We will review every detail carefully, Mr. Mayor." Marcus offered a quiet smile. "That is all I have asked for since this began. Facts, fairness, and accountability." Ethan remained silent, standing only a few feet away, watching the man he had believed was simply another anonymous pedestrian become the person every city official present instinctively respected. In that single moment, without raised voices, without anger, and without celebration, the balance of authority shifted completely, and everyone standing on Main Street realized that the most powerful person in the crowd had never needed to announce who he was. No celebration followed the revelation. Instead, the atmosphere settled into something far more powerful than triumph. It became quiet accountability. The crowd that had gathered outside City Hall no longer watched with curiosity. They watched with reflection. Phones remained raised, but the conversations changed. People were no longer asking who Marcus Bennett was. They were asking themselves how differently the morning might have ended if he had truly been an ordinary citizen with no public office, no familiar name, and no one to call. Chief Richard Collins turned toward the Director of Municipal Security and spoke in a calm but unmistakably formal voice. "Please preserve every available record from this encounter, including body camera footage, dispatch communications, and public recordings voluntarily provided by witnesses. An independent review will begin immediately." There was no anger in his tone, only procedure. The director nodded without hesitation. "Yes, Chief," the city attorney added. "We will also request statements from everyone directly involved so that every decision can be evaluated using documented facts." Marcus listened without interrupting. This was exactly what he had hoped would happen. Not immediate punishment, not public humiliation, just a fair process built upon evidence instead of emotion. Officer Ethan Brooks stood quietly, absorbing every word. Only minutes earlier, he had believed the situation would end with routine paperwork. Now he realized the paperwork itself would become the beginning of a much larger conversation. For the first time since approaching Marcus, he lowered his eyes, not because someone ordered him to, but because confidence built upon assumptions had finally met undeniable reality. Chief Collins addressed him respectfully. "Officer Brooks, you will complete the required reports, cooperate fully with the administrative review, and remain available for further interviews. Until that review is complete, your field duties will be temporarily reassigned according to department policy." Ethan nodded slowly. "Yes, Chief." His voice was quieter than anyone had heard all morning. There was no argument, no attempt to justify the moment. The process itself would determine the outcome. Marcus stepped forward before the silence became uncomfortable. "Chief, I appreciate that this review will follow established procedures. Accountability has value only when it is consistent." Collins answered immediately. "It will be, Mr. Mayor." The surrounding officials agreed with simple nods. Nearby, several witnesses voluntarily approached municipal staff members, offering copies of the videos they had recorded from different angles. A local reporter quietly interviewed business owners who had watched the encounter from beginning to end. Every perspective would become part of the official record. Marcus observed the scene with thoughtful eyes. The cameras, the reports, the statements, and the policies were all important, but he knew the greatest lesson would never appear in any written document. It would remain in the memories of everyone standing on that sidewalk. They had watched assumptions create unnecessary conflict, and they had watched truth resolve it without raised voices or retaliation. As Marcus prepared to leave, he looked once more across Main Street, where ordinary people had paused their ordinary day. He hoped that when they remembered this afternoon, they would not remember a mayor revealing his identity. He hoped they would remember that every person deserves the same patience, dignity, and fairness long before anyone discovers their title. Around him, the city slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, but for those who had witnessed the encounter, downtown Ashford no longer felt quite the same. 3 weeks later, the morning sun rose over Ashford just as it always had, warming the sidewalks, filling the coffee shops, and reflecting from the windows of City Hall. But for many people in the city, the meaning of an ordinary day had quietly changed. The independent administrative review had concluded after examining body camera recordings, dispatch communications, witness statements, and publicly submitted videos from every available angle. The findings were clear enough to support departmental action under established policies. Officer Ethan Brooks was officially dismissed from the police department following the completion of the review, not because one influential official demanded punishment, but because documented evidence demonstrated that professional standards had not been met. The decision became public through a formal departmental statement emphasizing accountability, fairness, and the obligation to treat every resident with equal dignity under the law. Marcus Bennett never held a triumphant press conference. He never criticized Ethan by name. Instead, he stood before reporters outside City Hall and spoke about something much larger than one difficult morning. "Today is not about proving that a mayor deserves respect," he began calmly. "It is about proving that respect should never depend upon a title. Every resident deserves to be heard before being judged. Every encounter deserves facts before assumptions. Every person deserves dignity before conclusions." The word spread far beyond Ashford. Local television stations carried the speech throughout the state. Community leaders discussed it at neighborhood meetings. Police academies requested permission to include the incident in future ethics training. What began as one unexpected encounter on a city sidewalk gradually became a conversation about professionalism, fairness, and the quiet responsibility carried by every public servant. Several months later, Marcus resumed his unannounced walks through the city. He still dressed simply. He still stopped to speak with shop owners, students, veterans, and families. The difference was subtle but meaningful. More officers greeted residents with patience before asking questions. More citizens felt comfortable beginning conversations instead of avoiding them. No city becomes perfect overnight. Marcus often reminded his staff. But meaningful change rarely begins with dramatic speeches. It begins with ordinary moments in which people choose to see one another as human beings first. One afternoon, Marcus paused outside the same coffee shop where so many witnesses had gathered that unforgettable morning. The owner smiled warmly and handed him a cup of coffee, refusing payment with a quiet laugh. "You reminded this city that character cannot be measured by appearance," she said. Marcus accepted the coffee with gratitude, but gently shook his head. "The city reminded itself," he answered. "People simply needed the opportunity to see the truth." As he continued walking down Main Street, nobody surrounded him with cameras or applause. He blended once again into the rhythm of everyday life, exactly as he preferred. Imagine standing there, watching a stranger pass by without knowing their story, their profession, or the burdens they carry. Would you see only what is visible, or would you choose to begin with dignity? Because the greatest lesson from that morning was never that a mayor was mistaken for an ordinary citizen. The greatest lesson was that ordinary citizens should never have to become mayors before they are treated with fairness. A badge can represent authority, a title can represent responsibility, but neither defines the worth of a human being. In the end, the law did not find its strength through power. It found its strength through truth, and truth quietly reminded everyone that justice begins long before anyone asks, "Do you know who I am?"